Early American postage stamps are windows into history.
Today, we'll explore 3 simple steps to welcome to stamps world, where every old stamp has a story and every collection may hold a fascinating piece of history. Today, we are taking a close look at the beautiful United States 5-cent George Washington stamp shown here. A classic blue stamp from 1932 that was issued as part of the Washington Bicentennial celebration. If you have found this stamp in an old album, envelope, family collection, or box of vintage stamps, you may be wondering how old it really is, why it was created, and most importantly, how much it could be worth today. So stay with us as we explore the history, design, printing details, condition, collector interest, and realistic market value of this historic American postage stamp. The stamp shown here is the United States 5-cent George Washington stamp from 1932. Catalogued as Scott 710, it was issued to commemorate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth. The stamp has a beautiful blue engraved design showing a detailed portrait of Washington with the large denomination 5C and the words U.S. postage at the bottom. The issue date was January 4, 1932, and it was produced by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C., using a rotary press. The stamp has perforations measuring approximately 11 by 10 and 1/2, and more than 170 million examples were produced. These details are important because they help collectors identify the stamp correctly and distinguish it from other George Washington stamps issued during different periods. One of the most fascinating features of this stamp is the portrait of George Washington. The design was based on a painting by the famous American artist Charles Willson Peale. Washington's face is shown in remarkable engraved detail, with fine lines creating the shadows around his eyes, cheeks, hair, and clothing. This engraving technique gives the stamp a classic appearance that is very different from many modern stamps. When viewed under magnification, the extremely fine lines become even more impressive, allowing collectors to appreciate the craftsmanship used by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing nearly a century ago. The portrait is not simply a picture placed on a piece of paper. It represents the artistic and technical printing methods of its time. The year 1932 was especially important in American history because it marked 200 years since the birth of George Washington. Washington was born in 1732 and became a central figure in the American Revolution before becoming the first president of the United States. To celebrate his bicentennial, the United States Post Office issued a special series of Washington stamps in different denominations. These stamps became known as the Washington Birth Bicentennial Series, and they are still popular with collectors today. The 5-cent blue stamp is one of the most recognizable examples from that series, and is an excellent representation of classic American commemorative stamp design. Now let's talk about the question that every collector wants answered. What is this stamp worth today? The most important thing to understand is that an old stamp is not automatically a rare or extremely valuable stamp. The 1930 5-cent Washington stamp was produced in a very large quantity, approximately 170,565,100 stamps, so ordinary examples are relatively common. Current dealer listings show ordinary examples selling for only a few dollars or less depending on whether they are mint or used. One current dealer lists a single Scott 710 at about $2.25, while another lists the stamp at around $3.5. A specialist dealer also lists used examples at modest prices and unused examples at a few dollars for a normal used example in good condition. A realistic market value can often be around 25 cents to $1, although especially attractive examples can bring somewhat more depending on the buyer and condition. As a real-world example, a pair of used Scott 710 stamps sold for $2.25 in a recent online auction, showing that collectors may pay more for multiples or particularly attractive examples. For an unused example with original gum, the value can be higher, commonly reaching a few dollars depending on centering, gum condition, and overall quality. A recently recorded sale of a fresh mint example was $2.65, which provides another useful indication of the ordinary market level. However, condition can make a major difference. When collectors examine a stamp like this, they look at the centering, perforations, paper quality, gum, color, cancellations, creases, tears, thinning, stains, and other imperfections. A stamp that is beautifully centered with clean perforations and strong original color is generally much more desirable than one that is heavily damaged or badly off-center. If the stamp is unused, the original gum on the back is also extremely important. A never hinged example with excellent centering can attract more attention than an ordinary hinged stamp. While a damaged or disturbed gum can significantly reduce desirability, the perforations are another important feature to examine. Carefully look around all four sides of the stamp and make sure the perforation teeth are complete and not heavily damaged. Collectors also look for straight edges, missing perforations, tears, or unusual separation characteristics. A stamp with damage may still be historically interesting, but its monetary value will normally be lower than a clean example. You should also avoid trying to repair, wash, straighten, or clean the stamp yourself because amateur restoration can permanently damage the paper and reduce collector interest. Another important point is the cancellation. If your stamp has a postal cancellation across the portrait or denomination, it is considered used. The cancellation itself can sometimes be interesting to specialized collectors, especially if it is an unusual town cancellation, a first-day cancellation, or another historically significant postal marking. But an ordinary cancellation generally does not make this particular stamp extremely valuable. On the other hand, a clean unused stamp with original gum can be more desirable. This is why collectors should examine both the front and back before estimating the value. Some collectors also search for varieties, printing differences, plate characteristics, and unusual flaws. With classic stamps, a tiny difference that looks insignificant to a beginner can sometimes be important to a specialist. However, it is very important not to assume that every line, dot, ink mark, or printing imperfection is a rare error. Before claiming that your stamp is a valuable variety, compare it with a reliable specialized catalog or have it examined by an experienced philatelist. A genuine variety needs to be identified correctly, and the difference between an ordinary printing mark and a recognized variety can make a major difference in collector interest. There is also a valuable lesson here for anyone searching for old stamps online. You may see advertisements claiming that ordinary George Washington stamps are worth hundreds, thousands, or even millions of dollars. These claims should be treated with extreme caution. An asking price on an online marketplace does not automatically represent the actual market value of a stamp. For this 1930 to 5-cent issue, the large production quantity means that an ordinary example is generally a modest value collectible rather than a million-dollar rarity. The real value of an individual stamp depends on its exact identification, condition, centering, gum, cancellation, variety, and whether there is something genuinely unusual about it. The good news is that even if your stamp is worth only a small amount of money, it is still a wonderful collectible. This stamp is more than 90 years old and connects directly to one of the most important figures in American history. It was issued during a major national celebration and was produced using engraving techniques that give it a distinctive appearance. For many collectors, the historical story is just as important as the price. A stamp does not have to be worth thousands of dollars to deserve a place in a collection. If you have this stamp at home, take a few moments to inspect it carefully. Look at the blue color, the details of Washington's portrait, the denomination at the bottom, the perforations around the edges, and the back of the stamp. If it is unused, examine the gum without touching it unnecessarily. If it is used, look at the cancellation and see whether you can determine where and when it was used. Also check whether the stamp is part of a larger Washington bicentennial collection. A complete set can be much more interesting to collectors than a single ordinary stamp, especially when the stamps are well preserved and properly centered. When storing this historic stamp, proper preservation is extremely important. Keep it in an archival quality stamp album, mount, or protective sleeve, and handle it with proper stamp tongs whenever possible. Avoid touching the surface repeatedly with your fingers because oils and moisture can affect the paper. Never use ordinary tape or household glue, and never attempt to clean the stamp with water or chemicals. Keep it away from direct sunlight, excessive humidity, and extreme temperatures. Good storage can help preserve the color, paper, perforations, and gum for many more years. So, let's give this 1932 United States 5-cent George Washington stamp a realistic final value estimate. For an ordinary used example in good condition, think roughly 25 cents to $1 as a reasonable general range, although individual examples can sell for more or less. For a normal unused example, a few dollars is a more realistic your productivity. Imagine achieving more while feeling less stressed. Let's begin. Next up, we are taking a close look at this beautiful old United States 3-cent Benjamin Franklin stamp. At first glance, this stamp immediately stands out because of its antique appearance, detailed engraved portrait, and classic lettering around the design. Benjamin Franklin is one of the most important names in American postal history, so stamps featuring his portrait are always interesting to collectors. But when it comes to an extremely old U.S. stamp like this, identification is very important because several early Franklin 3-cent issues can look surprisingly similar. The exact value depends on the year, printing, paper, color, margins, condition, and other small details. So let's take a closer look at what makes this stamp so fascinating. The design shown here features a detailed portrait of Benjamin Franklin surrounded by an oval frame, with the words U.S. postage around the upper portion and 3 cents across the lower portion. The portrait was produced using engraved printing, a technique that allowed the printer to create incredibly fine lines and shading. When you look closely at Franklin's face, hair, and clothing, you can see the many tiny engraved lines that give the portrait depth and character. This type of engraving is one of the reasons early American stamps are so popular with collectors. These stamps were not simply printed like modern pieces of paper. They were produced using specialized techniques that required considerable skill and precision. Benjamin Franklin has a unique connection with the United States postal system. Long before he appeared on postage stamps, Franklin played an important role in American postal history. He was appointed Joint Postmaster General of the American Colonies in 1753 and later became the sole Postmaster General. His experience with the postal system helped improve communication throughout the colonies. Because of this connection, Franklin became a natural choice for one of America's earliest postage stamps. His image has appeared on U.S. stamps for generations, making him one of the most frequently honored figures in American philately. The early Franklin issues are especially fascinating because they come from the first decades of United States postage. During this period, postage stamps were still a relatively new invention. The United States introduced its first nationally issued postage stamps in 1847. With Benjamin Franklin appearing on the 5-cent denomination and George Washington appearing on the 10-cent denomination. These early stamps were very different from modern stamps because they were generally imperforate, meaning they did not have the rows of small holes that later allowed stamps to be separated easily. Instead, sheets had to be cut apart manually. This is one of the important features collectors examine when identifying early U.S. stamps. The 3-cent Franklin design is particularly interesting because there were several different issues and varieties produced during the 19th century. Some early 3-cent Franklin stamps were printed in different colors, on different types of paper, and with different characteristics. Later issues were perforated, while earlier examples were imperforate. This means that two stamps that appear almost identical to a beginner can actually be completely different catalog listings and can have very different values. That is why experienced collectors do not rely only on the portrait or denomination. They examine every part of the stamp. One of the first things you should check is whether your stamp is perforated. Look carefully around all 4 sides. If you see small, regular holes along the edges, the stamp is perforated. If the edges are completely straight or irregularly cut without perforation holes, it may be an imperforate issue. This single detail can be extremely useful when identifying an early Franklin stamp. You should also examine the margins. With an imperforate stamp, the amount of paper surrounding the design can be very important. A stamp with wide, balanced margins on all sides can be much more attractive to collectors than an example that has been cut very close to the design. The color is another important factor. Early U.S. Franklin stamps were produced in several shades, and specialists pay close attention to these differences. Over the years, exposure to sunlight, moisture, chemicals, and poor storage can also change the appearance of a stamp. This is why you should not assume that the color you see today is necessarily the original printing color. Professional collectors sometimes compare stamps with specialized color references to determine whether an example is a normal shade or something more unusual. Condition is also one of the biggest factors affecting value. Collectors look for clean paper, strong design, clear margins, good perforations when applicable, and the absence of tears, creases, stains, thinning, or repairs. If the stamp is unused, the gum on the back can be especially important. Original gum that has not been disturbed can increase desirability, while damaged, removed, or heavily disturbed gum can reduce value. For used stamps, the cancellation is also important. An ordinary cancellation may not add much value, but a scarce or interesting cancellation can sometimes attract specialized collectors. Another fascinating area is stamp varieties. Early U.S. stamps were produced in large printing operations, and small differences can occur between positions on a printing plate. Collectors study these differences very carefully. Some varieties involve changes in lettering, frame details, printing characteristics, or other parts of the design. There can also be genuine printing errors and unusual examples. However, it is important to remember that not every dot, line, ink mark, or damaged area is a valuable error. Many marks are simply the result of normal printing, handling, or aging. Proper identification is essential before assigning a high value. Now let's talk about the most important question for collectors. How much could a stamp like this be worth? There is no single value that applies to every 3-cent Franklin stamp. The exact catalog number must first be determined. Common examples in poor condition may have relatively modest values, while scarce early issues, rare varieties, and exceptional condition examples can be worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. Some major early U.S. stamp rarities have sold for extraordinarily high prices, but it would be misleading to assume that every old Franklin stamp is extremely valuable. The majority of ordinary examples are much more affordable. The stamp shown in this video has a very old appearance, but a photograph by itself is not enough to provide a professional appraisal. To determine its exact value, a collector would want to examine the front and back under good lighting and possibly magnification. The paper, margins, perforations, gum, cancellation, and printing characteristics all need to be considered. In some cases, a specialist may also need to compare the stamp with a detailed U.S. stamp catalog. This is especially important for early issues because tiny differences can separate one catalog number from another. If you have discovered a stamp like this in an old family collection, the best thing you can do is preserve it rather than trying to clean or improve it. Never wash an old stamp, never use household glue or tape, and never attempt to straighten or repair it yourself. Even a small amount of damage can affect collector value. Instead, place it in a proper archival stamp mount or album and handle it carefully with stamp tons. Keep it away from direct sunlight, excessive moisture, heat, and chemicals. Good storage is one of the easiest ways to protect an old stamp for future generations. There is also something special about owning an early Benjamin Franklin stamp even when its monetary value is not enormous. This little piece of paper connects us with the earliest period of American postal history. It represents a time when communication was much slower, postage was a major part of everyday life, and stamps were becoming an important part of the postal system. Franklin himself had already played a major role in developing postal services before his portrait appeared on these stamps, so his appearance on American postage is especially appropriate for collectors. The history behind the stamp can sometimes be just as exciting as the price. Imagine this stamp being handled by people more than a century ago, traveling on an envelope from one location to another and eventually finding its way into a collection. Every old stamp has the potential to tell a story about the people, places, and communication systems of its time. That is one of the reasons Philately continues to attract collectors around the world. So, if you have this 3-cent Benjamin Franklin stamp, don't immediately assume that it is either worthless or worth a fortune. First, identify the exact issue. Check whether it is perforated or imperforate, examine the color, look carefully at the margins, inspect the front and back, and study the condition. If you notice something unusual, compare it with a specialized U.S. stamp catalog or ask an experienced philatelist for an opinion. A correct identification is the first step toward finding the real market value, and remember, when you see extremely high prices online, always be careful. An online seller may list an old stamp for thousands or even millions of dollars, but an asking price does not mean that someone has actually paid that amount. Real market value is based on actual sales, rarity, condition, demand, and accurate identification. For an early Franklin stamp, professional authentication can also be important when a potentially valuable variety or rare issue is involved. Next up, we are taking a look at a truly fascinating piece of early American postal history, this beautiful old United States 5-cent Benjamin Franklin postage stamp. The rich red-brown color, engraved portrait, classic U.S. postage lettering, and 5 cents denomination immediately make this stamp stand out as a historic collectible. Benjamin Franklin has one of the strongest connections to American postal history, so Franklin stamps from the 19th century are especially popular with collectors. If you have discovered a stamp like this in an old album, envelope, family collection, or box of vintage stamps, make sure you watch until the end because we are going to talk about its history, design, condition, and realistic market value. The stamp shown here appears to be an early imperforate 5-cent Benjamin Franklin issue from the 1850s, commonly associated with the 1851 issue. These early stamps are very different from modern postage stamps because they were printed without perforations. Instead of having small holes around the edges, individual stamps had to be separated from the sheet by cutting them apart. This makes the margins extremely important. When collectors examine an imperforate Franklin stamp, they carefully look at how much paper remains around the design on each side. A stamp with large and balanced margins can be considerably more desirable than an example that has been cut very close to the engraved design. The portrait of Benjamin Franklin is one of the most impressive features of this stamp. The engraving contains hundreds of extremely fine lines that create the appearance of Franklin's face, hair, clothing, and the surrounding oval frame. When viewed under magnification, the craftsmanship becomes even more remarkable. During this period, engraved stamps were produced using highly detailed printing plates, and the printing quality could vary from one example to another. Strong impressions with clear details are generally more attractive to collectors than weak or heavily worn impressions. Benjamin Franklin was a natural choice for early American postage because of his important role in the development of the postal system. Franklin served as a postmaster general during the colonial period, and his name became closely connected with American communications and postal history. When the United States began issuing its first national postage stamps in 1847, Franklin appeared on the 5-cent denomination, while George Washington appeared on the 10-cent stamp. Franklin's appearance on American stamps continued for generations, making him one of the most important figures in U.S. philately. This type of early Franklin stamp is interesting because identification requires more than simply looking at the portrait. Collectors examine the exact shade of red or brown, the style of the lettering, the frame design, the margins, the paper, the cancellation, and other characteristics. Early U.S. stamps can have different types and varieties that may look almost identical to an inexperienced collector. This is why a specialist catalog and careful examination are important before assigning an exact catalog number or value. Now let's talk about value. This is where things become especially interesting. Early 5-cent Franklin stamps can have very different prices depending on their exact issue and condition. An ordinary example with faults, narrow margins, or heavy cancellation may have a relatively modest value, while a well-preserved example with excellent margins, strong color, and a clear impression can be worth substantially more. For example, a recent online sale recorded a Scott 1-to-18515 5-cent Franklin at $179. Demonstrating that even an ordinary-looking example can attract significant collector interest depending on its characteristics. However, this should not be interpreted as a guaranteed value for every stamp that looks similar to the one shown here. The margins are particularly important for this stamp. Because it is an imperforate issue, collectors want to see clear paper surrounding the design. If the stamp has been cut into the design on one or more sides, its value can drop significantly. On the other hand, if all 4 sides have comfortable margins and the design is complete, the stamp can become much more desirable. This is one of the first things you should check if you have one of these old Franklin stamps. Condition is another major factor. Collectors carefully inspect the paper for creases, tears, thins, stains, repairs, or other damage. They also examine the color and impression. A stamp with strong original color and a sharp printed impression is normally more attractive than one that has faded or become heavily worn. The cancellation also matters. Some cancellations are common and have little effect on value, while unusual or historically significant cancellations can attract specialized collectors. The back of the stamp is just as important as the front. If you own an example like this, do not only examine the portrait. Carefully inspect the reverse for paper characteristics, thinning, repairs, stains, or other marks. Never peel the stamp away from an old album or envelope if you are not sure how to do it safely. Damage caused during removal can reduce its value. For a potentially valuable early U.S. stamp, professional examination may be worthwhile. Another important point is that not every old Franklin stamp is a rare fortune. You may see internet listings claiming that old stamps are worth thousands or even millions of dollars, but an asking price is not the same as an actual sale price. Real market value depends on rarity, condition, margins, authenticity, demand, and confirmed sales. Some early U.S. stamps are genuinely extremely valuable, but the exact identification must come first. A professional philatelist can determine whether a stamp is a common issue or an important variety. If you have this stamp in your collection, handle it carefully. Avoid touching the surface with your fingers and never try to wash, clean, straighten, or repair it yourself. Store it in a proper archival stamp mount or album and protect it from moisture, direct sunlight, heat, and chemicals. Even a small repair can have a major effect on the value of a 19th century stamp. So, what makes this Benjamin Franklin stamp special? It is the combination of age, historical importance, engraved artwork, imperforate margins, and Franklin's connection to American postal history. Even if your particular example is not extremely rare, it is still a wonderful piece of 19th century Americana. And if the stamp has unusually large margins, strong color, excellent condition, or a rare variety, then it could be considerably more interesting to collectors. Before selling a stamp like this, always get the identification right. Compare the design with a specialized United States stamp catalog, examine both sides, and consider professional authentication if the stamp appears particularly valuable. The difference between an ordinary example and a scarce variety can sometimes be hidden in very small details that are difficult to see without magnification and specialist knowledge. Thank you for watching Stamps World. If you enjoy discovering old United States stamps, Benjamin Franklin stamps, rare postage, vintage collectibles, and the real stories behind historic stamps, make sure to subscribe to Stamps World and turn on notifications for more videos. And if you have an old Franklin stamp in your collection, take a close look at those margins, color, cancellation, and overall condition, because those details can make a huge difference. Keep searching your old albums and family collections, because you never know when you might discover a fascinating piece of American postal history. Thank you for watching Stamps World, and keep collecting, keep learning, and keep discovering the amazing stories behind every stamp.